All right, hi everyone, welcome. Um, I want to take a moment to thank you all today for joining us. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director for the NACBX, and I am going to just briefly introduce our guests today and then turn it over to them for discussion. So we're joined today by Averill Earls, who is a historian of sexuality in Ireland and an award-winning baker. She's the co-founder and executive producer of Dig, a history podcast, and an associate professor of history at St. Olaf College. Her writing has appeared on Notch's blog and Nursing Cleo, as well as the Journal of the History of Sexuality and Historical Reflections. Her baking has appeared in the Minnesota State Fair, where she received a white ribbon for her honey ginger snap cookies, which sound amazing, in 2024. And she lives in Minnesota and spends summers in Vermont with her partner Dan and their dog Curie. And so she'll be joined in conversation today by Jarett Henderson, who is a historian at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he specializes in the histories of gender, sexuality, and settler colonialism in 19th century Canada. Before trading his snow boots for slides and his toques for beanies, he taught at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. His research explores how Canadian colonial governance was shaped by and contributed to broader trans-imperial debates about sodomy, whiteness, masculinity, and political authority. His current book project, Unnatural Sex and Uncivil Subjects, examines how the recriminalization of sex between men influenced the development of white settlers' self-government in the Canadian colonies. And he is also co-editing with TJ Talley and Kristen Thomas McGill the forthcoming volume, Queering the Tensions of Empire. So I hope everyone will join me in welcoming them today, and I will turn it over to you guys to get started.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us today. As Amanda explained, I'm zooming in from the University of California, Santa Barbara, which is located on the unceded territory of the Chumash people. I also want to start by acknowledging and thanking the North American Conference on British Studies for hosting this event, especially given the ongoing efforts to erase queer and trans histories. So conversations like those we have today mark important moments of resistance, and hopefully will also bring us some moments of queer joy on this timeline. I'm excited to be joined by all of you and, of course, my friend and colleague Averill Earls to chat about her impressive new book, Love in the Lav, a social biography of same-sex desire in Ireland, 1922 to 1972. So Love in the Lav revolves around what Earls calls the social biographies of those men implicated in sodomy and or gross indecency arrests in Dublin in what we might sort of think of as the mid-decades of the 20th century. The focus here on the social worlds in which these men operated, worked, and loved, especially their lives before, during, and after their encounters with the Irish Gardaí, those men tasked with policing the social and sexual order of post-colonial Ireland, allows us to see these historical actors as multidimensional, complicated, and sometimes the contradictory characters that they were. This is a multivocal history of both the men who did the policing and the men who were policed. So in doing this work, the sort of what I would like to sort of think about like the historian's hunt for case files, but also the genealogical work of building biographies, Averill has uncovered nearly 300 arrests for sex between men and a partner aged 15 and up. Of those roughly 300, 271 were from before 1951, and between 1952 and 1972, only 24 men were prosecuted for the crime of gross indecency. The careful attention here that Averill pays to the details of each of these cases is commendable. The charge, the verdict, the punishment meted out. And this allows us to see both the contours and the limits of the queer underworld that existed in 20th century Ireland. So these case files, rich in detail, and for those of you that have a chance to look at the text, sometimes uncomfortably so, are organized into 7 main chapters. The city, the bait, the cabbie, the solicitor, the boys, the predator, and the lovers. You get the point here. As a reader, this direct naming really helps you sort of zero in on the details, but at the same time, and at least unfortunately to me, it felt a little that it masked many of the nuances and the interpretations that are contained in each of the chapters. But what we're going to do together here is sort of zero in with Averill on some of the arguments and contributions of Love in the Lav. So how we're going to try and do this is we have a series of questions that Averill and I are going to discuss. As we're chatting about these, feel free to pop comments in the chat. We're happy to, as they tell us in pedagogical courses, popcorn to those in the crowd, and sort of let you sort of like jump in and engage as well. But we have a sort of series of questions that we want to make our way through, but also sort of make it sort of feel a little more conversational. So feel free to sort of jump in as we go. So to start then, to sort of help us and help everyone here get a sense of what Love in the Lab accomplishes, Averill, can you just sort of walk us through sort of like what drew you to this subject in particular? So like what drew you to the subject in particular? Why queer men? Why Ireland?
Yeah, so thanks, Jarett, for that introduction, and thank you, Amanda and the NACBS and everybody who's part of that organization who's here today, and everyone who's just attending. So the book project is built out from my dissertation research, which I chose this topic, I mean, for a couple of reasons. I did a master's project with Paul Dwan. He's here. Hi, Paul. Although he's driving to Montpelier, as he let me know in an email, so he's not going to talk. Don't text or Zoom and drive. That's very dangerous. I did my master's project on a comparative history of Ireland and Newfoundland child sexual abuse and priests in the Catholic Church. And so I had some intention of building on my preliminary work with that for a PhD project. I wanted to focus on Ireland because that was the more interesting part for me at the time of the master's project, but I really did not want to do child sexual abuse again because, as one can imagine, even in just a 2-year program, that was really draining and exhausting and emotionally a little bit too much for my still developing intellectual identity. So I had read Dermot Farrader's book, Occasions of Sin, and he talks in sort of sweeping broad strokes about this like collection of criminal court records that existed in the National Archives, but not really in any detail, not with much nuance or sort of deep dives into those cases, just sort of like broad strokes, occasionally a few case studies. So I went to Ireland for my PhD research in 2013. I went to the National Archives and I started combing through first the prison records and then through the court sort of calendars, and then found what were gross indecency and sodomy court files and started calling those up, 10 at a time, which was the max you could request because these are all held off site at the National Archives. And I had my partner with me, and so he also got to request 10 per day. And so over the course of 3 months, we pulled every single one that we could find. And that's not, so the numbers that Jarett shared are what I was able to find. That doesn't mean that there weren't more, and there's evidence to suggest that there were certainly more, particularly in that 51 to 72 period that has the fewest, but that they're either sealed or that they were destroyed or that they were not included in what was available to me as a researcher in 2013, or even 2023 when I went back and tried to find more. So there's there's more, right, than seems visible. And so I wanted to find queer people generally in archival material, and women just simply were not visible in what was available at the National Archives. And there's some like literary mentions in the National Library of Ireland, but to find women I mean, it still will take more work and perhaps more creative thinking than I, as a freshly I was barely even a history major when I started this PhD project, was ready to sort of tackle, but I do hope to, build on this work, eventually to expand beyond the gendered elements of the work that I'm doing right now, or have done so far. And so men were what I found in these state-based records. And so I just sort of have run with it since 2013, and here's the final product that I'm happy to deliver to the world. Happy-ish, it's sad
Yeah.
sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah. Understandable. Awesome. Thank you. So as you sort of like just sort of walked us through, right? So this sort of body of evidence, this sort of corpus of evidence that you have, right? 300 cases of men arrested for having or attempted to have had sex with another man, right? Not all of these men, right, get equal attention in Love and the Lav, right? That would have been an impossible task for anyone to try and do, right? So how did you sort of settle then on the biographies of the men that you have sort of picked as sort of like the sort of backbones of these chapters and the narratives that you tell? So like I work with 19th century cases, so like and they are much less detailed than the ones that you have here. So like I know how difficult it is to like build these biographies. So I'm interested in sort of like you to have the chance to sort of share sort of like the difficult labor that went into this, like why these biographies and not others, and like just how did you do it?
Yeah. I mean, I really highlighted what were to me the most interesting cases because they had uh, more significant traces or just larger files in the court records. A lot of the 300 cases are just like this person is accused. Here is the Garda's testimony that said that they did the thing that they did, and then they're pushed through, right? Like there's no investigative detail. There's not many other witnesses because for the most part, these were not cases that involved multiple witnesses. They were just active police going around and waiting for people to quote unquote commit crimes so that they could be arrested in this surveillance sort of state. And even then, you don't get a sense that there's like a real enthusiasm for the work. Otherwise, there would be a lot more, right? There would be a lot more cases in the records. So yeah, I think I highlighted the cases that after I finished my dissertation, I went back to them and I was like, well, there's so much more than I was able to just cover in in what was my sweeping generalizations of a dissertation, particularly the Henry Coughlin and John Bodkin, the Bait chapter, and the James Hand chapters, and then also actually the Ronald Brown, which started was I turned into an article first, and then is the solicitor chapter in the book. Um, those were all things that I just like mentioned in the dissertation because they were part of this overwhelming data set. And then when I went back, because I was thinking about what this book project would be, I wanted to emphasize their stories. And those were individuals whose stories I had not had a chance to flesh out. And I took the opportunity with the book project with more time and care and, yeah, investigative skill.
Yeah, yeah. In doing that sort of like investigative stuff, right? Like I like thinking about like ancestry and like just also like ancestry.com, but then also just like similar names with people. Like was that like how like yeah, right? Like like how that sort of factor in here as well, right? We're sort of just trying to like piece together those like backstories of these chaps.
Yeah, unfortunately there are a lot of people with the same name in Ireland. It's wild. Particularly these men who I ended up focusing on. Ronald Brown was an easy sort of one to flesh out, which is probably why it was my article case study because he was like a known figure, a public figure, as opposed to these other working class men who are most of the other case studies. And so starting with him, I could build out, I could find him in newspaper records because there's like a picture of him because he was involved in Anoiga, which is this youth hostel organization. And so once I figured out that I could do that for him, I figured out I could do that for more of them. John Bodkin was a little bit harder. There are more John Bodkins in the UK and in Ireland than there are, like, I don't know, than Ronald, well, no, not Ronald Brown, but I don't know, like Carl Hayden's probably. Um, and but that I was able to find more of him also in the broader national archives because his case because he was a British national and so he had this whole like immigration bit because they're like, oh, you should get out of the country, but also you're sick, so we're gonna let you stay. So there's all these like complications that made investigating them a little bit more interesting. Um, and then with the police, I think was the most fun, challenging uh, genealogical research because, of course, they all have records with the Garda archive, which were provided to me, but then rescinded because, once they learned that I was not just like a family member who was interested in learning about my apparently like 15 police officer ancestors, they decided that I was not allowed to have those records. But there's also some of the TCD has digitized some of the Garda police records, which allowed me to find them by tracing their badge numbers and their names, which are in the police or in the court records, to their official police file. So, like, there's so many. I mean, in Irish history, this is perhaps easier to do than for some. I mean, it's probably as easy to do as for the US, I would say, because there are so many digitized archives that have pretty decent um, OCR transcriptions, but also because so many people are invested in their own Irish ancestry and genealogy that there are lots of resources. There's like a dedicated genealogist at the National Archives of Ireland, and their whole job is to just like chill there and wait for regular people to come in off the streets and be like, "My grandmother was Irish. Do you know her?" Or whatever, like so there's lots of opportunity, and so I feel like that was a boon for me, but also yes, because everybody is named the same thing for a lot, like Michael Moore. There's like 10 billion Michael Moores, who some of them left Ireland. Is that the same one? How do I find out? Figure out if they've written letters to their sister. We're like,
Yeah.
it's challenging, but it was a lot of fun too in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, for sure, right? So I think one of the things that struck me about Love and the Lav, right, was just how much attention like the Gardaí, so the team of officers or individual Garda, like one chap, right, received from you, right? So it reminded me of Vice Patrol by Anna Lvovsky, sort of that sort of traces how and the different tactics that the police are using in the United States to sort of criminalize and profile like queer men, right? And so like I think your focus here on sort of like the Vice Squad and like the debates that sparks in Ireland is impressive, right? And it also makes me feel like a bit of a naughty gay to say this, but like those police chapters were like my favorite chapters of the book themselves, right? And I was really sort of taken with the debate in the late 1940s and the early 1950s over like who could just be an officer themselves, right? Like was having a burly chest and being 5'9" enough, right? And the answer was no, right? And so like sort of thinking here about sort of like um the different chapters and sort of the organization of the book, right? So like my favorite stuff was the police stuff, right? This is a really long way of asking you sort of like what's your favorite chapter or what was like the most fun part of this to write for you?
Yeah. So the bait, I think, chapter, the one about John Bodkin and Henry Coughlin. John Bodkin is the man who was arrested, and Henry Coughlin was the undercover police officer who used entrapment effectively to, like, he was participating in the crime to be able to then put this other man into prison. That's probably my favorite chapter. It was the second chapter after the Solicitor Brown that I went back to. And I just am really fascinated by the unseen, and I can't give you like hard evidence of the conversations that were happening at the top level because that according to the Guard archive, those conversations are not preserved in the archive. I've asked twice or multiple times. Every year I ask, and they're like, "Oh no, we don't have that stuff here in our archive. We don't keep those kinds of records here." So I'm having to like sort of reconstruct these conversations out of the snippets of, well, this Garda said, I was instructed to do such and such, or my superior officer told me to go back to this place and to do whatever was necessary to take in this dangerous man. And so from that, you get the sense that there's clearly some sort of formal, if not recorded, maybe it was recorded and just destroyed, system for policing sex, but also you see the strains on the system, right? Because they never have enough men in uniform. They never have anyone who's like excited to do this kind of work. The one time in the 50s when they do pull together like a team to surveil this one spot for the whole summer, they rake in 50 guys, right? Like they arrest 50 people. So clearly it was all happening. It was possible, given the resources, to do it, but that there was a reluctance or a shortage of time and money and officers to dedicate to that. And so I'm super interested, and I hope that in future works that other people are working on, they're able to find some more of these answers. Like, what are those conversations? Who's having them? And are they being preserved? And yeah, so I'm hoping that someday someone will find the things that I wasn't able to find. But I feel like there's a sense that you get from what I have been able to piece together. And so the bait is my favorite chapter, but I also really love James Hand. So we could talk about that at another time.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. Thank you. So I was really hoping here to sort of like to sort of like, I don't know, tease out a little bit, and sort of take a moment to sort of think about the way in which Love in the Lab sort of like plays with or uses this concept of what post-colonial is. So at different times, like it feels like it's doing a variety of types of sort of like lifting, right? Like sometimes it's a chronological placeholder for use to sort of like talk about sort of like the Free State and its apparatus, right? To mark itself as different. But also there's sort of like hints of it being used as sort of like forms of resistance, I think. So I want to sort of let you sort of like articulate for us sort of like what do you want us to understand about what makes the queer histories told here post-colonial, right? Like what makes these queer histories here post-colonial?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that there's something particular to the Irish Free State and its, the efforts of those who are arbiters of this Free State to project to the world a particular identity, right? And that's the Ireland is pure and chaste and moral, and not just pure and chaste and moral, but more moral and pure and chaste than Britain, right? And that is in many ways the post-colonial identity of these people who take over after the initial Free State is formed and start to double down on this Catholic identity, not just Christian, but Catholic identity as the basis for that morality. And in that way, right? What's interesting, of course, is that they're also doubling down on the forms of repression and oppression that the British introduced to Ireland through the systems of law and colonialism that had taken place over the previous 300 years. So it's it's unique and not unique, right? Because of course Britain and the United States and Canada were also criminalizing sex. So these people who are in many ways colonizers or involved in the colonial process of Ireland are doing the same things. Um, but we see this sort of efforts of the state, and I think we see it probably more particularly in the ways that the Free State is dealing with women, even more so than queer men. That those are the unique markers of Irish post-colonial identity, right? That this performance of morality, which is largely written onto the bodies of women and queer people, and driving sex workers underground and putting women who are too loud or too queer or too whatever into Magdalene laundries, taking unwed mothers, putting them in mother and baby homes and taking their children away. And then also these like efforts at particular political moments, not always, but at particular political moments of change and shift, whether it's the shift into Fianna Fáil's rule, or it's this 1950s moment where there's like a little bit of a we're like declaring ourselves truly a republic. So what does that now mean for us? That those are moments when there is this spike in policing sex between men in public spaces, never in private spaces, right? Like the impetus is not to control what people do in private for the most part. It's unless, with the rare exceptions of like Solicitor Brown, who's this public figure, we can't have that, or James Hand, who's this like brothel owner or whatever, but mostly public sex because we don't want the visible. We don't want women acting out in ways that are not consistent with this new moral Catholic identity. We don't want men having sex in public, right?
Yeah, no, awesome. Absolutely. So I think that sort of leans into, which is a kind of a conversation that's starting to happen in the chat here by Carl, sort of thinking about religion is sort of like where I want to sort of like move next. So like this is sort of like a thank you, Carl. This is a good segue. So like it would be hard to talk about Ireland without talking about religion, right? And so like Love in the Lab certainly makes the case that there's this sort of like muscular heterosexual Catholicism that is central to these post-colonial discussions, right? And definitions of masculinity and patriarchy, as you sort of like have spelled out for us. But I was actually kind of struck by the lack of like religious figures themselves in the text, right? It kind of like haunts this text, right? So they're not either, they don't really appear as sort of like individuals charged. They don't really appear as sort of like individuals that have thoughts on the matter itself of sex between men. And I found this really striking. And especially in sort of some of the things that we know about the way in which that sodomy was policed in other sort of like Catholic states. So thinking about Zeb Torderici stuff in New Spain, right, where like he has just found some of these things that went on in those confession booths that are just like mind blowing, right? So like I was like, what do you make of this sort of like absence here? Or was this just a result of sort of like your focus of building out from the cases that you had themselves, right? How do we make sense of this?
Yeah, I think it's both, right? So Farrader in Occasions of Sin talks about how Charles Archbishop John Charles McQuaid was making these speeches or writing about the how we got to curb the queer men in Ireland in private correspondence. And he like points to these records in the diocese archives that I could not trace. And when I showed the record, you know, like the call number to the archivist, they're like, "This doesn't exist here." So I don't know what this is, but what it's supposed to be, but we can't find it. So in part, my lack of those voices, right, like the from the pulpit is a lack of my ability to find them. I don't think that I think that in many ways there probably were some of those conversations happening in churches on Sundays for sure, and certainly in the confessional. You know, and we see a little bit of that in like some of the memoirs of Irish people, but those were not necessarily constraints over the individuals that I yes that you point out that I'm focusing on in these chapters. So the conversation is there, and it seems to be more of like a shell over my book rather than deeply interwoven. But certainly, you know, you can't extricate the experience of sex and sexuality in Ireland from Catholic identity and Catholicism in the post-colonial states emphasis and utilization of and in many ways um, reliance on guidance from, right?
Yeah.
Because there's this relationship between the state and the hierarchy that is preserved in the archives, right? With conversations back and forth, and it's not always one of the archbishop says this, and then the party in charge does what they say, right? It's a lot of push and pull, and that's
Yeah.
something that's certainly true of like Eamon de Valera pushing back and not saying the Catholic Church is the official state church, but it has a special place in Ireland. So there's a little bit of that as well, I think. So those tensions are there, but that doesn't mean that Eamon de Valera like rejected his Catholicism, and he certainly expresses his desire to impose that moral, what he sees as that moral box of Catholicism onto Ireland.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. So it reminded me of like in the Canadian context, a historian named Tamara Myers has done work on like the juvenile justice system of like boys in French and Catholic Quebec. And so like that was sort of where she was able to sort of find this stuff, not in sort of like the more criminal court stuff that you were working with. So like, it was just interesting to sort of like see where this stuff appears and where it doesn't appear.
Yeah.
And so like that's helpful for us. So thank you.
Oh, I
Um,
should say, since we're going to talk
yeah.
about this maybe later, but the things that didn't make it into the book, right? Like there are no Catholic priests who are arrested for sex between men, that exist in the archive. If those arrests were made, there's a likelihood that they were expunged, taken out, or turned over straight to the Catholic Church to deal with. I found one case of an Anglican priest who was arrested. He didn't make it into the book. Maybe he'll be an article in the future if I just keep hammering this material over and over until it's completely dead. But that's that in of itself is interesting because um, he then falls outside that sort of tricky relationship between the church and the state, the Catholic Church and the state, right? He's not protected by that particular special relationship. Yeah.
Awesome. So one of the things that I like to do when I teach queer history here at UCSB is have the students spend some time working with the newspaper columns. And so like getting to think about like what was reported, what wasn't, how do we make sense of this? And so like as us as historians or as students of history ourselves, right, this has fundamentally changed over the past 20 plus years of like how we use newspapers and how that works. I make them read Chuck's article, so great that you're here to sort of like correct what I might say. But right, like Chuck's work, right, sort of sees that there is more detailed coverage than we thought. Different newspapers and different editors published more or less depending on their sort of like political slants or their sort of intent. So I was hoping that you might sort of like flesh out for us sort of like how you just did this newspaper work itself, right? Sort of like what were some of like the perils and pleasures of doing this newspaper work, and if you sort of saw any differences between what particular presses were saying or not saying about the cases that you were working with.
Yeah. So I usually started with newspapers to do a genealogical investigation, right? I would just search a person's name to see what would come up in the newspapers. And that's often where this person has the same, like Michael Moore, there's again 1,000 Michael Moores who lived in this time period. So there's no way that I'm going to necessarily find the right one. But I did, I looked through every single Michael Moore hit over the course of 20 years just to see what I could see. Um, so finding them in that way helped me see the ways that gross indecency and sodomy cases were and were not reported in the newspapers. And sometimes, right, like the Irish Independent gave a full accounting of this person is is being charged with indecent crimes or indecency or crimes of gross indecency, and this is their job and this is where they live and here's all these particular details about their life, but um, those are fewer and far between, right? Like there are some people whose cases were never made it to the newspapers, which is interesting. Like how, why was the person who's supposed to be reporting on the court records just not was they sick that day? Like so, I don't know the answers to those questions. But then I was also really interested in using newspapers just to like leaf through and see what life is like, right? Like and I've you look through thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of digitized newspapers through the Irish Newspaper Archive, just leafing through, trying to look for like the personal ad sections that that are common in other places, and not finding them really frustratingly, because I would have loved to find more love in this
Right.
research rather than persecution, but that was really hard to do. Um, and so newspapers are useful, and then they also have their major limitations, right? If OCR is not very good, then you're not going to find the search results that you're looking for. And if you're just flipping through, that's when you notice, oh, they only have like May through October of 1931. Where are November and December? And January and February and March and April. So there are many limitations to using these archives, and then you have to go to where they exist, if they've been preserved in a place like the National Library. So I enjoyed. It's frustrating. It's exciting, but it didn't always give the answers that I wanted, which is why, in many ways, this book I had to keep digging further. Right, I had to go to those other genealogical resources to find more about the individuals that I was looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, those newspaper hunting stories are interesting. So I have this one case that I was trying to piece together. And so like I had found the newspaper that it should be in. I had found the run of it like after the case. But the coverage of it just before it was happening, those issues are mysteriously disappeared. Like they're not, and I was like, my conspiratorial brain is like that they've been destroyed, but like they could, like who knows, right? And like some of these questions like we'll never be able to figure out, but
Yeah.
trying to think about and piece together like what is happening with it, what like with this coverage is fascinating. And Chuck's article is great to help students do that, and like I really appreciate you doing that writing for us, Chuck. I have thinking about your sort of like more love comment, leads me to want to sort of think about talking about the title. So like Love and the Lav, right? It should come as no surprise, right, to any of us here, right, that we find queer men cruising in public lavatories or in restrooms, right? One of my favorite articles to teach is Stephen Maynard's Through a Hole in the Lavatory Wall, right? It blows students' minds, right? We also see it in the present day with like men posting their favorite cruising spots on TikTok now, right? So like it's not like there's nothing particularly like new about like the lavatory, right? So I get the lav part, right? But I must confess, right, like I was a bit taken by the love part in the title, right? And it made me wonder here about the line between sex and desire and love, right? And so how like did you settle on like having love in the title? Were there other titles that you had thought about and cast aside, right? Like why love?
No, I've been holding on to this title since 2014 when it came to me, and I was like, I'm not wasting that on the dissertation. Mostly, I think love to me is connection and it's understanding. And in the context of my book project and the men who I focused on, I observed a distinct lack of connection and understanding from the state, from families. And so in many cases, the men that I'm talking about in this book had to go into these places, seedy, dirty, whatever, dangerous, to find that connection and understanding, to find men like them, to find a moment of, well, I can act on what I'm feeling, and in this moment, but this is it, right? Like this is off. These are like fleeting and potentially life ruining, and yet they did it again and again and again, and they didn't resist that inclination. So it's the comparison with today with favorite cruising spots on TikTok. Those are This is a different world, right? This is a different world where that's they're not, well, they might get arrested for public indecency or whatever, but there's so much more flexibility and understanding and acceptance, and the shell or the feelings of acceptance and connection are not limited to these like moments that are fraught and in the toilets, on the streets, in the alleys, right? So for me, that is why I have doubled down in many ways on the title "A Love and Laugh," because yes, it's sort of flippant if you just think about it for a moment, but really to me it's the heart of the book, right? Like that the men who were caught did so knowing that they might be caught, that they very well could be caught, that it was dangerous, but that this was the place that they went to find that moment, in a world where their love was just not accepted, where their desire was not accepted. Plus, it's just alliterative. So there you go.
Yeah, no, awesome. Thank you. So the last thing that I had wanted to sort of ask is that, well, this is a book about queer men. Sometimes their families when you found them, sometimes about those individuals that caught them, right? There are some great sort of scenes of their bodies being inspected, and sort of the testimony in court, right? And you talked a little bit already about sort of like how there's not very many women that you were able to sort of locate, which is sort of sad for us all as historians. So just to sort of like wrap this up here, sort of like what did not make it into Love and the Lav, right? And are there things that like you wanted to make it into here, or that just didn't fit and are going to be somewhere else in the future? Like sort of like what didn't make it in here that you just are like still like working through?
Justin Bengry asked me this question because I'm writing a little puff piece, not a puff piece, a piece for Notches in supporting the promotion of the book, about, you know, the preference there for Writing for Notches is writing something that didn't make it into the book. And I was like, oh, I got everything into the book that I wanted. And then as soon as I started thinking about it, there are so many things that didn't make it into the book. The Anglican priest, this man, Michael Moore, who I excluded really intentionally, and this is what the blog post is about, because his he was arrested at 18. He's the only man I ever found who was arrested for multiple accounts of gross indecency, whose records are preserved in the archive. But after he was 18, the next time he was arrested, it was because he was entrapping 12 and 14-year-olds into sex. And I had decided to draw the hard line at I'm only going to talk about the individuals who were themselves able to be or were targeted by the state, the attorney general, the judges, to be accused and charged. So 15 and up was where the state drew the line. So I drew that line too, because again, I didn't want to talk about child sexual abuse and coercion, even though I know we have to know that 12, 14, 13, 10-year-old boys were part of the sexual economy. They absolutely were, in this sort of really desperate queer landscape in for same-sex desiring men in mid 20th century Ireland. But I chose to draw that line for myself, and so Michael Moore doesn't make it into the book, even though his case, his files are huge, right? Like there are tons and tons of witness testimonies, and there are 6 of them in total, in addition to vagrancy, and he like tried to stab some guy one time. So there's a lot going on with Michael Moore. And then women, right? Like, obviously, I would have loved to find some evidence of queer women persecuted for in some way, or not, or just queer women, period. I don't
Yeah,
need to be persecuted. It would be nice if they weren't persecuted. But those records don't exist in the state archives. And I have this theory that I can't prove because I don't have access to the archives, that they're in the Magdalene laundries, right? Like that women working class women, I should say, who wanted to be with other women were identified by their families, by their parish church, right? Like their clergy, that they were too dangerous. They needed to be confined to effectively slave labor in the Magdalene laundries. We have evidence of elite women, right? Like Mary McAuliffe's work on revolutionary leaders who go off and live their basically aristocratic lives, middle class lives, doctors and writers and poets who are able to ignore the rules of society, much like the men in chapter 7, the lovers, Macklemore and Hilton Edwards, right? They get to live above the sort of rules of everybody else, because of their class and their status. Um, and so those women exist, and there's some pretty good evidence about their love and experiences there. But they are not really they're not the stories that are being told. Right. We need the stories that are not being told. The working class women, where are they? They're locked away in the Magdalene laundries, likely.
yeah.
So
One of
hopefully in
the
my lifetime,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, fingers crossed. One of the only examples that like I know of from like the Canadian context is work by this historian named Constance Backhouse. And it was the sort of mixed race couple, 2 women in like the Canadian North. And she found it in like the mid 20th century. And it got to the judicial system because it was an assault case over an attempted kiss. So this is sort of the way in which that it sort of made its way into the legal records there. And like if I remember correctly, the judge who tried the case was like, it's the case of capital L lesbianism, right? And like they're trying to sort of define what this term itself means, right? So like there might be there in different ways, right? But yeah, it's like finding this stuff is difficult. So I commend you in your efforts. So thank you. I am happy to open it to the floor if anyone has questions or comments or thoughts or observations, or just applause for Averill. But open it up to the floor for a few moments here if anyone has a question that they want to ask. Otherwise, I applause. Yeah, go ahead, Chuck. You can. There we go.
I think that's unmuted me. All right. Averill and Jarett, thank you both. I mean, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I came in with a few questions listed, and you guys have kind of systematically worked through a lot of the topics that I was interested in. Maybe just a couple of quick observations. One, that idea, Averill, you had mentioned about feeling like they're following a pattern and everybody knows it, but nothing's written down. Totally got the same thing. I mean, yes, that's something. If you figure that out, let me know, because I'm trying to, occasionally magistrates sometimes will actually share some notes, at least on some things. And that was kind of a place that I got some information. But yeah, that's a super tough one. First off, too, I would just say I really love this idea. I mean, what you said about love as just was so beautiful and right on, I thought. And yeah, and that fact that you said that you can feel the love just in these people going to these places. Yeah, I mean, for me, the people who kept scrapbooks in my own work, right, where they would clip these stories out of the newspapers and post them in books, nothing but stories of arrest and prosecution and condemnation, but they saw themselves in there, you know. So I think you're totally right to go with love. And I think too, you know, probably implicit in there where you said you're only looking at people 15 and up, right? I think that's also exactly right with your focus on love, right? Because sex with a child is sex without consent, which is violence, which is not about love. You know, your right to follow your desires ends where they inflict on someone else, right? And violate someone else's rights. So I think that those are totally consistent, that you would leave that out, even though it was a really rich material. Um, and so maybe circling around just to a question to you, I'm sorry if I'm going on too long on this, but I just thought that, you know, this idea of how to bring women into this, I would just throw out, and this might be something that would be speculative talk in general, but I think you're already kind of halfway there with the focus on excavating state archives to get to the personal stories, right?
Yeah.
Because women have the personal stories. And Anna Clark, I think Anna Clark has done the absolute best work on thinking about identity and self-understandings. And, you know, it's the cultural text that people have access to, putting those together for their desires. You can do this for the 18th, for the 19th, for the 20th, for the 21st century, right? You know, and if you're thinking of, and you're already doing that with the state records, right? And I mean, and maybe this is where this morphs into a question for you, right? Because if it's about sort of piecing together these personal stories, and I know this is kind of the hardest thing to get, but you know, this idea of how did people feel about themselves? Do any of the scraps that you found talked about how people thought about what they were doing? And can you see any change over time in that from the start of your period to the end of the period, right? And that maybe is a connection for, you know, even just a few stories about women. Often the stories that we do find about women are much more richer, can be more rich in personal detail, and actually get at that type of information with one or two records in a way that for guys, you have to piece it together through 100 different arrests. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, for particularly for the heart of the book, which seems to be 1922 to 1952, although I do try to cover the 50s and 70s. 50s and 70s, I think that's where we start to see that shift about thinking about identity and self, in not so much in the records, because the court records, there are people who are reflecting on the crime, and they're like, but they're mostly saying, you know, I didn't know, or I didn't mean to, or can you just let me go, right? Like those kinds of conversations. They're desperation, they're not self-reflection. But certainly that's when I have seen, and we've started to see folks who are writing more about their identities and experiences with queerness, like Brendan Behan and Borstal Boy, right? Like that there's a little bit more of that coming out into cultural and phenomena, as opposed to pre 1950. There just really isn't much in the South. That's not, there's, you know, Tom Hume is doing some great work on the North, and he has this, you know, the find of all finds, a diary from a guy who lived in this period that I'm talking about, in the North. And you see his development as he like struggles with his identity, as he tries to find his place, as he tries to develop connections with men over this period, as he's trying to figure out like language to describe himself and to describe his world. That's certainly captured there. But for the men that I found, I have not yet, but I, you know, maybe when, now that the book's out, the ancestors, or the, you know, the descendants of these people will be like, oh yeah, we have his diary, do you want it? That's my actual dream and hope, because I would love to know like what James Hand thought about his life, because James Hand's case is this incredible thick folder full of testimonies from like dozens of people, but not him. He doesn't even get a testimony, a statement about his arrest. Everybody else involved in the case, people in his family, his friends, their statements are in there, but not his. But I, you know, you can piece together some of the ways that he thought about himself, perhaps from that, because he's like this sassy, has like frenemies all over town, and because of one of those frenemyships, he ends up in the eye of the cops. And so there's little bits and pieces that, you know, that I have imagined in many ways by piecing together the experiences, his relationship. He lives really close to his family, like they're just a few blocks away from each other for their entire lives until he goes to prison. He takes over the business from his dad. Like those kinds of details give me a sense of what he might have thought about himself, but I just can't know because I don't want to presume too much. I want to flesh out what his life looked like, but to trace how he thought about himself and how any of these men thought about themselves over the course of particularly those first 30 years of the Free State, is hard with court records. But again, I'm really hoping that somebody will read this and be like, yeah, I've got Ronald Brown's diary, I've got James Hand's like his scrapbook, right? I would love for that to come out of this project, if nothing else.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last call for questions. Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
I don't get to a question, but first I just want to say, Averill, what a fantastic piece of work you've done. It's just been incredible to see the information that you've been able to discover and put out there for us to have. As you know, we're in a process at the moment and have been for a number of years now to try and find a legal way to, in other countries, they pardoned people who were convicted under the laws that existed. We're going down a different route, and I can see my colleague Kieran Rose is on, and it's mostly down to him through his work on the working group that advised the government on what directions to take on this issue, that we are looking at a disregard scheme by which the convictions themselves will be kind of set aside, but the records won't be lost to history. So that's a really important thing to have as well. So first of all, well done for that, because it's going to be so helpful in educating the politicians who will be voting on this legislation when it comes around, and informing them on what the situations were like. I think you're right on the issue of women. We have a huge amount of information on men, obviously. I like 2 years ago, I got invited to what used to be Grange Gorman, the mental asylum here in the north part of Dublin, Dublin City. It's been turned into a university campus now, and they put on a play with the students based on all the records that they found of patients who had been institutionalized in there. And it was incredible to see. Like, obviously they hid names and any identifying issues, but what they went through, like, it was news to me that Ireland was the capital of institutionalizing people in mental asylums in the world. Not just based on per capita, like, we had the volume of people who were being put into these institutions was just phenomenal. And I suspect, and it is suspected, that a lot of the people, maybe women in particular, middle class and upper middle class women, um, who could be sent to the Magdalen laundries because that was for the working class women, were probably institutionalized there as well in those places. And that's how they were hidden away, because you couldn't have those going to court. And to a certain extent, the laws didn't cover women. If women were caught having sex with each other, they weren't covered by the law. It was only men, basically, who were covered by the law. Unless you found a judge, I suppose, who thought indecency or whatever was two women having sex with each other as well. So it's really important what you've done. It was alluded to that maybe there's more material there, and will we see another book at some stage in the future, or do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, so yes and maybe. Actually, my next project right now that I'm working on, I've got an article coming out that comes out of the Irish Sexualities Conference that Queen's University Belfast and Ulster University organized last January, is on psychiatry, and I've gotten access to the Grange Gorman sealed files and have 10 cases of people who were institutionalized between 1930 and 1950 for quote unquote sexual deficiencies. One person for secondary sex characteristics, which sounds like someone who might be intersex. So I'm really going to try hard to locate that person in the genealogical records and flesh that out. Two women, and the rest were men, and two of them were for rape. So it's not one for one, right? Like what's interesting is that the psychiatry establishment, or organization in Ireland, which is really advanced in a lot of things and on the cutting edge in some ways, and then also sort of over institutionalizing certainly in other ways. There's I haven't yet found evidence of the chief medical officers in these institutions thinking about or talking about or dealing with this idea of sexual deviance as like a mental illness, even though there are these 10 cases. That's 10 cases of, like, as you know, like thousands, right? Like hundreds of people are being admitted every day just to Grange Gorman, which is mind-boggling. So there there is some possibility that there are a few there, but not nearly as many as you would find even in like the US or the UK, right? And oftentimes in other cases that I've looked at, um, up into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, folks were being sent to the North, like middle class men in particular, were sent to the North for institutionalization because that's where they would receive care for, to be fixed basically for their quote unquote sexual deviance. So it's really interesting, and I don't have answers yet, but that is part of the current project, is thinking about that and trying to find women and men and apparently intersex people, trans people in the institutions. It becomes much more common to send folks in Ireland, in the Republic, to institutions in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, for sure. And that's when I think the psychiatry embraces that sort of broader, medical model that is more common earlier in other places, which is really interesting. And I think it's in part because Ireland, while it's institutionalizing people at huge rates, it's also sort of controlled by just like a few people. Like the head of the institution is sort of shaping psychiatry for most of the region, which is really an interesting model. Yeah. So yes. And also I'm working with the Dublin City Council to do an oral history project of queer and trans people in Ireland. Obviously, that's going to rely on living memory, but we're hoping to get back to the 60s, 70s folks who were living in grooving and cruising in those eras before liberalization.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Averill, for writing an excellent book. For those of you who have read Love in the Lab, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. For those who have not, I hope we've convinced you to go read it. Amanda has put a link in the chat where you can get it for 20% off. So be sure to click that before the Zoom box closes. Thank you all for being here, and take care and stay safe.
Yeah, and
Thanks.
I'll also include that link in the follow-up email with the recording. So if anyone's interested. And yeah, thank you guys. Thanks to both of you so much for such a wonderful discussion. And so I hope everyone will help me in thanking Averill and Jarett today.
Thank you for coming, for taking
Everyone.
time out of your day. Enjoy your lunch.
Thanks.
Yes.